Okay, so I am now going to move on to making the toile. I've got my calico fabric and I'm not going to film the process because I'm going to film the whole thing making it in the actual fabric. So there's no point doing it twice. So what I'm going to do is use the magic of editing to just... Done. Let's have a look at some of the details of it. So all in all, I'm very pleased with it. And there's only very few minor changes I'll need to make. Other than that, we'll be ready to cut it out in the real fabric. Hello everyone, I am back again with the third installment now of the video diary series that documents my recreation of Audrey Hepburn's dress from Breakfast at Tiffany's. If you've watched the first two videos, you will know that so far I have done the research, I have made the toile, and now I can essentially start making the recreation, the actual dress. I've got the fabric, I've got the trim, and as you will have just seen in that previous clip, what I've spent the past couple of days doing is dyeing the ivory fan-shaped trim into the appropriate pink so that I can use it on the dress. If you look at the dress now as it is in the museum, the fan shapes seem to be more of this kind of yellowy, creamy colour. But if you look at photos of the dress at the time during the making of the film, it seems to be more pink. It's sort of a peachier pink colour. This may be because an unstable dye was used at the time, which has meant that with age the colour has faded into this more yellowy shade. It's not really uncommon. A lot more unstable dyes were used at the time, so it's not unusual for colours to fade with age. But what I'm going to do is make it more like the original peachy pink colour, because I think it complements the pink fabric that it'll be on much better than the more yellowy tone that it's turned into. So I have got my trim, I have got my Swarovski crystals that I'll be using, and I have just now thread traced the pattern pieces onto the pink silk fabric. Thread tracing is something that was done in couture, as opposed to marking the pattern pieces with chalk or pencil or pen even. Thread tracing can be removed. As soon as you've finished sewing those pieces, that thread can be taken out. And it is more time consuming, but it doesn't scar the fabric, it doesn't mark the fabric. I personally think it makes it more precise because none of those markings are going to fade or anything, that they're still there. So when it comes to sewing it, I find it a lot easier to have those thread markings there. So before I go ahead and sew those pattern pieces together, I need to do the beading and embellishment. So when it comes to embellishment and beadwork and embroidery, all that is done to the shape of the pattern pieces before they are sewn together, as opposed to trying to do it once the dress is sewn, because once those pieces are sewn together, they become three-dimensional. They become sculpted to the body, and it makes it very difficult to do that beadwork and embellishment onto fabric that won't lie flat because it's now been sort of sculpted into 3-dimension. So all of that needs to be done while it is flat, while it is not sewn. So now that I have thread traced the fabric, I can get on with the embellishment. But before I've done that, I've had to do a lot of maths, and it's not my favorite thing. I don't have a head for maths particularly, but basically I've needed to try and work out how far apart I can space the fan appliques, because I have a certain number of them. I have a limited amount. I bought the entire stock of this trim. So I think I have 1,050, and I need to figure out how far apart I can sew them together. And I recruited my friends to help me with this, and we think that we will need to space them 3.5 centimeters apart. As you can see, this is my little grid with the markings on, so I know how far apart to space them. And the way I'm going to sew them onto the fabric is using a big embroidery frame that I actually found in the local charity shop for I think about £10. It's this big standing wooden, it was dark wood originally, but I painted it so that it would look a bit nicer. But it's this big standing embroidery frame, and what I'm going to do is essentially stretch the fabric over it, not too tight. It doesn't need to be particularly tight, as long as there's enough tension there that it lies flat and can be sewn on smoothly, so there's no wrinkles or puckering. It doesn't need to be stretched really taut, but I'm going to put that on my embroidery frame, then I can mark the little markings with my grid here and start sewing on. So that is what I'm going to spend the next few weeks of my life doing. So let's just hope that the maths is right. Okay, so Houston, we have a problem. I've been spending the past 3 days sewing all the embellishment on the back skirt panel, and it was going really well, and I'm so pleased with the way it looks. I think it looks so good. And even though the fans are a little more spaced apart than the originals, I actually really like it. I feel like you really get to appreciate the pink fabric underneath as well. And I sort of, dare I say, actually kind of prefer it slightly more spaced out than on the original when they're so spaced together, so closely spaced together. As I was sort of starting to finish this panel, spending my third day on it, I was really starting to think, wow, I'm using quite a lot of these fan shapes. And then when I took it off the frame, and firstly, after I got over how great it looked, because I'm genuinely so pleased with how it looks, it's so exciting for me to see it come together, I then realized that I needed to count them because there looked to be far more on there than I thought there would be. And lo and behold, I counted, and just on that small back skirt panel, there's 357, and I have 1,000. And I still have to do the entire bodice and the huge front skirt panel, which is, I think it's about 3 times the size of the back skirt panel. So I did the maths again, and I don't have enough. I'm not going to have enough to do the whole dress. Which is, it's so disappointing. A silver lining is that we redid the maths and realized that in order to be able to cover all the pattern pieces with these fans, they would have to be spaced 4.5 centimeters apart instead of 3.5, which would have looked, that would have been just too far apart. They would have been too far spaced. That's a whole centimeter extra between each one, and that would have been too far from the original. So that's a silver lining, because regardless of whether we got the maths right or not, I still wouldn't have had enough, and I still would have had to rethink how I was going to do this. So there's always a solution. In my mind, there's 2 options here. The first is that I can make the skirt a lot narrower than it is. And just for reference, the original black version of the dress, if anyone has watched the first video in which I do the research, you'll know which dress I'm talking about, seemed to have a much narrower skirt than the pink version that we later saw. So in order to make the skirt, in order to have enough fans to cover the whole dress, I would have to make the skirt as narrow as the black version of the dress. The second option is that I try and find another trim that looks similar and combine the two together and keep the silhouette exactly the same. So sort of combine 2 different trims that I could hopefully find one that looks relatively similar and keep the silhouette the same. So those are my 2 options. I asked you all on Instagram what you thought, which option you would prefer. I put a poll on my stories, and in general I think it was pretty much split down the middle. I think the final result was about 60-40 in favour of having a narrower skirt, which is interesting. And I still haven't decided, but I think, to be honest, I can't really make a final decision until I see what other trims are out there and see just how close I can find the replacement trim could be. Because of this, it does mean that I'm not going to make my original deadline for this project, which was the 19th of October, which is the 60th anniversary of the London premiere of Breakfast at Tiffany's. It was a great deadline to have, and it would have been very, serendipitous to have it finished for the day of the 60th anniversary of the premiere. However, I'm just not going to be able to make it feasibly. If I now have to try and find a new trim and then dye it and do all that, that's going to take a lot longer. I would also far prefer now to take my time with this and get a better result than to try and cram it all in to still meet this deadline and not be happy with how it looks. I'm definitely going to finish this dress. It will happen, and it won't be next year. It will still be in the near future, it just won't be in that deadline, which I'm really sorry about, but I hope also you agree that it would be better to have as accurate and close as possible than something that is crammed in and just a bit more underwhelming. So, game plan. I'm going to be looking for a new trim. I'm going to be ordering some samples. I'm going to try dyeing them, see how close I can get it to the trim that I've got. In the meantime, I can also continue to bead and embellish the bodice, because I have enough of the trim to cover the bodice and about a third of the front skirt panel, I think, or maybe half. And I would much rather that the bodice had all matching fans on it. So that's where I'm at. It's disappointing. It's been a bit stressful the past few days, and it's sort of started to take the fun out of this project, which is a shame because that's basically the reason I started it in the first place. And so I'm not going to let that happen. These things happen. That's life. And I'm going to keep going and try and get this dress finished. And I will keep you updated about the trims and if I find anything that's going to work. Right, so here's been my dilemma. This is the trim I need to find an alternative for. And it was originally ivory. I dyed it this shade of pink for the dress. I've had 2 samples come, one of which I thought would be really good, but then it arrived and it is about half the size of the original, so that's not going to work. This one has also arrived, and although the actual trim itself looks quite different, I think this is going to work. Because once these little fan shapes are cut out, it actually doesn't look too different in scale to this. Of course, this is ivory as well, but this is a synthetic trim, which means that I can't use the same dye that I used for this because it won't take, because this is natural fiber and this is not. So the dye that I used for the original pink would just slide right off and wouldn't take, which makes it even more complicated because then I have to use a different kind of dye which is suitable for synthetic fabrics, and then try and match the shade to the original, to this one. So I'm going to try and dye this sample that I've got to match this color. Okay, update. I have been making several different dye baths to try and match the colour of these originals to the replacement trim that I've got. These are the originals and this is the replacement and the colour that I've been able to do. Now, this is actually coming apart a little bit because I've handled it too much, but I think it might be okay. The little legs, the tentacles, whatever you want to call them, are closer together. This is just starting to fray a little bit, so I'll have to glue the edges of that as I did with these. But I think when they're sort of combined, you might not notice. They might sort of just blend in with each other. That's the hope. Ooh, we might have found a solution. So that concludes this video in this part of this series. I have had more than a few hurdles in this episode, but hopefully I will have found some solutions that can help keep this project going. As I say, have found a trim that I think will work as a replacement, and when the two are compared, they actually don't look too dissimilar, which is reassuring to say the least, because for a moment there I really didn't know what I was going to do about it. But now that I have all the materials in place again, it means that I can continue working on this dress and hopefully get it finished. So thank you so much for following me along on this part of the video series. I hope you're all staying well wherever you may be, and I will see you all in the next one.